Hey everyone, in tonight's mystery, we present The Night the World Almost Ended, the 1983 nuclear false alarm. A Soviet radar system falsely detected incoming US missiles, and one man's decision in the dead of night may have saved humanity from nuclear war. It's one of those stories that leaves more questions than answers. And tonight, you'll hear it all. So before you ease in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, lie back, listen closely, and drift off as the mystery unfolds. Picture this. You're settling into your favorite reading chair on a September evening in 1983. The world outside feels perfectly ordinary. Somewhere, people are watching Cheers on television, kids are trading baseball cards, and your neighbor is probably still trying to figure out how to program that newfangled VCR. But 40 miles south of Moscow, in a bunker that looks like it was designed by someone who thought comfort was a dirty word, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov is about to have the worst night shift of his life. You know those nights when everything that can go wrong does? Well, imagine that feeling, but instead of your coffee maker breaking and your car not starting, the stakes involve every living thing on the planet. Petrov is sitting in front of a console that looks like something from a science fiction movie. All blinking lights and serious looking buttons that you'd be terrified to accidentally lean against. The OCO early warning system stretches across the Soviet Union like an electronic spiderweb, its satellites perched in space with one job: watch for American missiles. It's 1983, and the Cold War isn't just cold, it's practically Arctic. President Reagan has been referring to the Soviet Union as an evil empire, a characterization as diplomatic as calling your mother-in-law's cooking interesting. Meanwhile, the Soviets are convinced the Americans are planning a first strike, possibly disguised as a military exercise. Petrov isn't your typical military officer. While his colleagues tend to see the world in stark black and white, he views it more like a complicated jigsaw puzzle where half the pieces might be from different boxes entirely. Tonight, he's the duty officer at Serpukhov 15, a facility so secret that it doesn't officially exist. You could drive past it and think it's just another unremarkable Soviet concrete building, which is precisely the point. The evening starts quietly enough. Petrov reviews reports, checks systems, and probably wishes he'd brought a thermos of something stronger than tea. The bunker hums with the white noise of electronics and ventilation systems, creating that particular kind of institutional quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every small sound. But here's where our story takes its first unsettling turn. At 12:15 a.m. on September the 26th, the early warning system decides to have what you might politely call a moment. Red lights begin flashing with the urgent persistence of a smoke detector with a dying battery, except the alarm isn't alerting you to burned toast. It's announcing that 5 American intercontinental ballistic missiles are heading towards Soviet soil. In the Hollywood version of this story, there would be dramatic music, people shouting, and someone would definitely spill coffee on something important. But reality is quieter and somehow more terrifying. The computer screen displays the information with bureaucratic efficiency, indicating that incoming missiles have been detected, launch sites identified, impact time is calculated. Have a lovely day. Petrov stares at the screen, and you can imagine his thoughts racing like a hamster on an espresso bender. Protocol is crystal clear in situations like this. Report the attack immediately to Soviet command, who would then have perhaps 20 minutes to decide whether to launch a retaliatory strike. It's not a decision you want to make before you've had your morning coffee, except it's past midnight and morning feels very far away. The weight of the moment settles around him like a heavy blanket. This isn't a drill, and there's no do-over if he gets it wrong. Pick up that red phone and you've potentially started World War III. Don't pick it up, and you might have just let your country get destroyed without warning anyone. It's the kind of choice that makes deciding what to have for lunch seem refreshingly simple. Now, it's crucial to imagine yourself in Petrov's shoes, which likely weren't the most comfortable ones to begin with. You're looking at a computer screen that's essentially telling you that Armageddon has begun, and you have minutes, not hours, not days, but minutes, to decide what to do about it. It's like being asked to choose between chocolate and vanilla ice cream, except one flavor might accidentally end civilization. But Petrov has something that saves the world, a beautifully stubborn streak of skepticism. While the computer insists that 5 missiles are inbound, his mind starts picking apart the scenario like a detective examining a crime scene. 5 missiles? Really? If the Americans were actually launching a first strike, wouldn't they send everything they had? 5 missiles would be like trying to knock down a brick wall with a handful of pebbles. Technically possible, but probably not the strategy you choose if you really meant business. You see, Petrov understands something that the computer doesn't: context. The early warning system is brilliant at detecting heat signatures and trajectory calculations, but it's terrible at understanding human nature. It can tell you what appears to be happening, but it can't tell you whether it actually makes sense. The minutes tick by, like hours. Somewhere above, those satellites are faithfully reporting data, completely unaware that they might be triggering the end of the world over what could be a cosmic misunderstanding. Meanwhile, Petrov is doing something that computers can't. He's thinking about the bigger picture. He considers the geopolitical situation like someone examining a complicated recipe. The Americans, for all their bellicose rhetoric, haven't shown signs of preparing for an actual nuclear exchange. Their military exercises, while provocative, have followed predictable patterns. And if you were really planning to start a nuclear war, you probably wouldn't begin with just 5 missiles when you had thousands available. It would be like deciding to redecorate your living room by painting only one wall. But doubt is a tricky companion at moments like this. What if he's wrong? What if this really is the opening salvo of an American attack, and his skepticism is about to cost his country its only chance to respond? The weight of potentially millions of lives presses down on his shoulders like the world's most uncomfortable backpack. The fascinating thing about this moment is how ordinary it feels from Petrov's perspective. There's no dramatic music, no cinematic tension, just a man in a concrete bunker, looking at flashing lights, trying to decide whether the world is actually ending. It's a bureaucratic apocalypse, which somehow feels more frightening than the Hollywood version. Other officers in the facility are looking at him expectantly. They can see the same warnings he can, and they're waiting for him to follow protocol. The red telephone sits there like an invitation to disaster. One call, and the Soviet nuclear arsenal would begin its deadly countdown. The machinery of mutually assured destruction would grind into motion, and there would be no taking it back. But Petrov does something remarkable. He chooses to trust his instincts over his technology. In an age when we're constantly told that computers are smarter than humans, that data doesn't lie, and that machines are more reliable than intuition, he decides that sometimes human judgment trumps electronic certainty. He doesn't pick up the phone. Instead, he reports the incident as a system malfunction. The incident is classified as a false alarm based on his assessment of the situation, although it has not been proven or confirmed. It's the kind of decision that either makes you a hero or has you court-martialed, with very little middle ground between those two outcomes. The clock continues its relentless advance, and the missile impact time approaches. If Petrov is wrong, Soviet cities are about to be destroyed, and his refusal to report the attack will go down in history as one of the most catastrophic errors in human judgment. If he's right, well, nothing will happen, which is sometimes the most beautiful outcome imaginable. You know that feeling when you're waiting for important news, maybe test results from the doctor, or whether you got that job, or if your teenager made it home safely. That suspended animation, where time seems to move like honey in winter, that's where Petrov finds himself, except the stakes are slightly higher than usual. He's essentially betting the world that his gut feeling is more accurate than a multi-million-dollar early warning system. The beautiful irony of this situation is that if Petrov is right, nothing dramatic will happen. The missiles won't arrive, the world won't end, and most people will never know how close they came to a very bad day. Success in this case looks exactly like an ordinary night where nothing interesting happens. It's like being a smoke detector. You're only noticed when things go wrong. Meanwhile, the ecosystem continues its electronic insistence that doom is imminent. The satellites don't have the luxury of doubt. They're designed to report what they see, not to philosophize about it. From their perspective, 40,000 miles above Earth, they've detected heat signatures and trajectory patterns that match their programming for incoming ballistic missiles. They're doing their job perfectly, which is exactly the problem. But here's something wonderful about human nature. We're remarkably good at pattern recognition when we let ourselves think instead of just react. Petrov's brain is working like a master detective, examining not just the immediate evidence, but the broader context. Why would the Americans attack with such a small number of missiles? Why now? Why this particular configuration? It's like looking at a painting and noticing that while all the technical elements are correct, something about the composition feels wrong. The brush strokes are right, the colors are accurate, but the overall picture doesn't make sense. Petrov is seeing past the technical data to the human logic underneath, and that logic is telling him something important. This doesn't feel like how a real nuclear attack would begin. The minutes crawl by with the enthusiasm of a reluctant student heading to detention. If those missiles are real, they should be showing up on ground-based radar systems soon. But as the projected impact time approaches, something beautiful happens. Nothing. No secondary confirmations, no radar contacts, no mushroom clouds on the horizon. Just the same ordinary September night that was quietly minding its own business before the computers decided to panic. You can imagine the relief washing over Petrov like warm water after a cold shower. His instincts were right. The early warning system, for all its technological sophistication, had essentially cried wolf, or in this case, cried nuclear war, which is considerably more serious than a wolf but follows the same basic principle of false alarms causing unnecessary panic. But the story doesn't end there, because now comes the part that often gets overlooked in dramatic retellings, the aftermath. Petrov has to explain to his superiors why he chose not to report what the computer said was an incoming nuclear attack. This is like trying to explain to your boss why you decided not to evacuate the building when the fire alarm went off, except the building is an entire country and the fire alarm costs more than most people's houses. The investigation that follows is thorough and probably not particularly fun for Petrov. Military bureaucracies are not known for their appreciation of freelance thinking, especially when it comes to nuclear warfare protocols. You don't just ignore early warning systems because you have a hunch, at least not without filling out a considerable amount of paperwork afterward. But here's the thing about being right in a spectacular way. It tends to vindicate even the most unconventional decision making. The technical analysis eventually confirms what Petrov's instincts told him that night. The satellites had misidentified sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds as the heat signatures of missile launches. It was a cosmic case of mistaken identity, like thinking your neighbor's garden hose is a snake. Now, you might expect that someone who single-handedly prevented World War III would become an instant celebrity, maybe get a parade, and certainly earn a spot in the history books. But you'd be forgetting something important about the Soviet Union in 1983. They weren't exactly in the business of advertising their technological failures, especially when those failures nearly triggered nuclear Armageddon. Instead of becoming a hero, Petrov finds himself in the peculiar position of being the man who saved the world and can't tell anyone about it. It's like performing the most important magic trick in history and then being sworn to secrecy about how it was done. The Soviet military, understandably embarrassed that their expensive early warning system had confused clouds with missiles, decided that the less said about the entire incident, the better. This is where the story takes on an almost surreal quality. Petrov goes back to his regular duties, probably gets his regular paychecks, and continues living his life while carrying the knowledge that he once held the fate of human civilization in his hands. It's the ultimate example of carrying your work stress home with you. The fascinating thing about this period is how normal everything feels. The world continues spinning, people go about their daily lives, and nobody knows how close they came to a very different kind of morning on September 26th. It's like learning that your morning commute regularly takes you past a dormant volcano. Technically, nothing has changed, but somehow everything feels different once you know. Petrov's colleagues at the facility are aware of what happened, of course, but they're bound by the same secrecy requirements. Imagine having the most interesting story in the world and not being allowed to tell it at parties. It would be like winning the lottery and having to pretend you're still worried about your electric bill. But secrets have a way of eventually surfacing, like corks in water. The story begins to leak out through various channels. Military historians, investigative journalists, and former Soviet officials who feel more talkative after the Cold War ends. Each telling adds new details, new perspectives, and new appreciation for just how close humanity came to accidentally destroying itself over a meteorological misunderstanding. What emerges from these accounts is a portrait of a man who was remarkably well suited for his impossible moment in history. Petrov wasn't a maverick or a rebel. He was simply someone who understood that sophisticated technology is only as good as the human judgment that interprets it. He had the rare combination of technical knowledge and common sense that allowed him to see past the flashing lights to the bigger picture. The more you learn about that night, the more you realize how many things had to go right for the story to end well. Petrov had to be the duty officer. Someone else might have followed protocol without question. The false alarm had to be ambiguous enough to allow for doubt. A more convincing fake attack might not have triggered his skepticism. And perhaps, most importantly, the geopolitical situation had to be stable enough that taking 20 minutes to think didn't cost everything. It's humbling to realize how much of human survival can depend on individual moments of good judgment. We like to think that our systems are foolproof, that our safeguards are redundant, and that catastrophe is prevented by institutional wisdom rather than individual insight. But sometimes it comes down to one person in a bunker, looking at flashing lights and deciding to trust their instincts over their instructions. The story of that September night is ultimately about the irreplaceable value of human judgment in an automated world. Computers can process information faster than humans. Satellites can detect heat signatures from thousands of miles away, and early warning systems can calculate missile trajectories with mathematical precision. But they can't do the one thing that saved the world that night. They can't step back, look at the bigger picture and say, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. You know how sometimes the most important events are the ones that don't happen? Like when you almost get into a car accident but don't, or when you nearly say something you'd regret but catch yourself just in time. The night of September 26, 1983, is one of those non-events that changed everything precisely because it remained a non-event. The beautiful thing about disasters that don't occur is that life continues with blissful ignorance of what might have been. People wake up the next morning, complain about their coffee being too cold or too hot, and worry about perfectly normal things like mortgage payments and whether their kids are doing their homework. The world keeps spinning, completely unaware that it almost didn't. But in the shadowy world of nuclear strategy and Cold War politics, Petrov's decision sends ripples that spread far beyond that concrete bunker outside Moscow. The incident becomes a case study, though a classified one, in the limitations of automated systems and the continuing importance of human oversight. Military strategists on both sides of the Iron Curtain begin asking uncomfortable questions about their own early warning systems. What if this had happened to American computers? What if the false alarm had been more convincing? What if the duty officer had been someone less inclined to question the technology? These questions don't have comfortable answers, which is precisely why they need to be asked. The technical investigation into the false alarm demonstrates the ease with which a combination of circumstances can fool sophisticated systems. The combination of sunlight, clouds, satellite positioning, and computer algorithms resembled an incoming missile attack to electronic eyes. It was like a perfect storm, except instead of rain and wind, it was photons and software creating the potential for nuclear winter. This discovery leads to improvements in the ecosystem, better training for operators, and more robust procedures for verifying alerts. But it also highlights a fundamental truth about the nuclear age. No system is perfect, and the margin for error in nuclear warfare is essentially zero. You cannot partially launch a nuclear missile, start World War III in a limited way, or nearly destroy civilization. These are binary choices with permanent consequences. The incident also becomes a quiet catalyst for broader discussions about nuclear strategy. Not immediately, of course. In 1983, both superpowers are still deeply committed to the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. However, the close call raises questions about the effectiveness of highly sensitive alert systems and automated reactions to possible dangers. Think about the psychological weight that Petrov carries after that night. He knows something that almost nobody else knows: how fragile the peace really is, how easily a software glitch or a meteorological anomaly can bring two superpowers to the brink of nuclear exchange. It's like being the only person who knows that the bridge everyone drives across every day is held up by a single bolt that's working loose. Years later, when the Cold War begins to thaw and people start talking more openly about close calls and near misses, Petrov's story takes on almost mythical qualities. Here was a moment when the entire trajectory of human history pivoted on one person's decision to think rather than react, to question rather than comply, and to trust human judgment over mechanical certainty. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Petrov is how he handles the knowledge of what he did. There's no swagger, no sense of self-importance, and no demand for recognition. He simply did his job as he understood it, made the best decision he could with the information available, and then got on with his life. It's the kind of quiet heroism that doesn't make for dramatic movies, but represents the best of human nature. The story also serves as a reminder that the Cold War, for all its grand strategies and elaborate theories, ultimately came down to individual human beings making decisions under pressure. All the sophisticated technology, all the careful planning, and all the military doctrine in the world couldn't eliminate the need for someone to look at a situation and decide what it actually meant. The peculiar thing about preventing the end of the world is that it doesn't feel like much of an accomplishment at the time. There's no medal ceremony for disasters that don't happen, no parade for catastrophes avoided, and no Nobel Prize for best use of common sense in a nuclear crisis. Petrov goes back to his regular life, carrying the weight of what he knows but unable to share it with anyone who wasn't there. This phase is where the story becomes almost absurdly normal. The man who saved civilization goes home to his apartment, probably watches television, and maybe argues with his neighbors about parking spaces. He continues his military service, deals with the bureaucracy of the Soviet system, and lives the kind of ordinary life that's only possible because extraordinary disaster was averted. However, secrets, particularly significant ones, have a tendency to demand disclosure. As the years pass and the Cold War machinery begins to creak and eventually collapse, the story of that September night starts to emerge from the classified shadows. Military historians piece together accounts, former Soviet officials become more talkative, and gradually the world learns about the night it almost ended. When Petrov's story finally becomes public, the reaction is fascinating. People struggle to comprehend how close humanity came to accidental self-destruction. It's like learning that you've been walking across a tightrope without realizing it. Technically, nothing has changed, but your perspective on everything is suddenly different. The story serves as a compelling argument for nuclear disarmament, but not in the way you might anticipate. It's not the horror of nuclear weapons that moves people, but the absurdity of the situation. The idea that a computer glitch and some oddly positioned clouds could have triggered World War III makes the entire nuclear standoff seem less like strategic deterrence and more like an elaborate game of Russian roulette with the entire planet. Petrov himself becomes something of a reluctant celebrity in his later years. He conducts interviews, accepts awards, and speaks at conferences about nuclear policy. But he always maintains a kind of bemused detachment from his role as the man who saved the world. To him, he was simply doing his job, making the best decision he could with the information available. The fact that this decision happened to prevent global catastrophe was, in his view, almost incidental. This perspective is both refreshing and slightly unsettling. We want our heroes to be heroic, to understand the magnitude of their actions, and to carry themselves with the weight of their accomplishments. But Petrov's ordinariness is precisely what made him effective that night. He wasn't trying to be a hero, he was trying to be right. The story also raises uncomfortable questions about how many other close calls there might have been, and how many other Petrovs have made similar decisions without the world ever learning about them. The nuclear age is full of incidents that were classified, buried, or simply never reported. Each represents a moment when human judgment stood between ordinary life and extraordinary catastrophe. Perhaps most importantly, Petrov's story serves as a reminder that the most crucial decisions are often made not by presidents or generals, but by individuals in the right place at the right time with the courage to trust their instincts. History is shaped not just by grand strategies and sweeping movements, but with quiet moments when someone looks at a flashing computer screen and decides to think before acting. The man who prevented nuclear war by refusing to panic becomes, in his quiet way, a symbol of everything that's best about human nature under pressure. This is not the dramatic heroism of action movies, but the thoughtful heroism of taking a breath, considering the options, and choosing wisdom over protocol when the two conflict. And so we come to the end of our story, though of course it's not really an ending. It's more like the moment when you realize that what seemed like thrilling mystery was actually a meditation on the nature of courage, judgment, and the strange ways that history unfolds. Stanislav Petrov lived until 2017, long enough to see the Cold War become a historical curiosity, to watch his story become known around the world, and to receive recognition for his role in preserving human civilization. But by most accounts, he remained remarkably unchanged by his brush with global significance. He was, to the end, simply a man who had done his job well at a crucial moment. The lesson of that September night isn't really about nuclear weapons or Cold War politics, though those are certainly part of the story. It's about the irreplaceable value of human judgment in an increasingly automated world. It's about the importance of maintaining the ability to step back from the immediate crisis and ask the larger question: does this situation make sense? In our current age of artificial intelligence and algorithmic decision-making, Petrov's story feels particularly relevant. We're constantly being told that computers are smarter than humans, that data doesn't lie, and that machine learning can solve problems better than human intuition. And in many cases, this is true. But on that night in 1983, human intuition saved the world precisely because it could do something that computers couldn't. It could doubt. The most important decision in human history was made by someone trying to be careful, not someone trying to be important. Petrov's goal was not to become a hero, but to prevent a mistake. From his perspective, avoiding this particular mistake was almost beside the point, even though it saved every living thing on Earth. This fact is perhaps the most comforting aspect of the entire story. The world wasn't saved by superhuman wisdom or extraordinary courage, but by ordinary human judgment applied thoughtfully under pressure. It suggests that most of us, faced with similar circumstances, might be capable of comparable clarity. The heroism wasn't in being special, but in being sensible. As you drift off to sleep tonight, you might gain comfort in knowing that somewhere out there, in control rooms and command centers around the world, there are people like Petrov, individuals who understand that the most sophisticated technology is only as beneficial as the human wisdom that guides it. These individuals understand that sometimes the most important action is to take a breath, look at the bigger picture, and trust your instincts. The night the world almost ended turned out to be just another night, which is precisely how it should be. The missiles that weren't there didn't arrive. The war that wasn't starting didn't begin, and humanity continued its long, complicated, often absurd journey through history, all because one person in a bunker outside Moscow decided to think before acting, to question before reacting, and to trust human judgment over electronic certainty. And perhaps that's the most beautiful mystery of all, how often the most extraordinary outcomes arise from the most ordinary virtues. The world was saved not by heroes, but by someone doing his job carefully. The world was saved not by dramatic action, but by thoughtful inaction. It was not someone who sought to alter the course of history, but rather someone who merely aimed to achieve accuracy. Sleep well, knowing that sometimes the most decisive victories are the ones that look like nothing happened at all. Occasionally, the greatest courage is simply the wisdom to pause, think, and choose understanding over urgency. And sometimes saving the world is as simple as trusting that 5 missiles don't make sense when you could send 500. The night the world almost ended was, in the end, just another night. How the best ending should be. So quiet and ordinary that you almost don't notice them happening. You've probably heard the name whispered in documentaries or stumbled across it in some late-night internet rabbit hole, the Mary Celeste. The name Mary Celeste resonates effortlessly, doesn't it? However, this evening, as you find comfort in your preferred chair with perhaps a cup of tea cooling on the side table, let us embark on a journey into one of the ocean's most captivating mysteries. Picture yourself on December 5th, 1872, somewhere between Portugal and the Azores. The Atlantic stretches endlessly in every direction, looking like rumpled blue silk under a winter sky. You're aboard the Dei Gratia, and frankly, it's been a rather boring voyage so far. Captain David Morehouse has been grumbling about the weather, the crew's been playing cards with increasing desperation, and you've read the same book 3 times. This kind of tedium makes you appreciate the fact that Netflix has not yet been invented. Then something catches your eye on the horizon. The ship is in motion, resembling an inebriated individual struggling to maintain a straight path. Her sails are set oddly, flapping in ways that would make any sailor wince. It's the maritime equivalent of watching someone wear a shirt inside out, technically functional, but obviously wrong. As you draw closer, you realize the problem isn't just poor seamanship. This is the Mary Celeste, a merchant brigantine that should be sailing purposefully toward Italy with a cargo hold full of denatured alcohol. Instead, she's drifting like a lost shopping cart in a parking lot, responding to wind and current with the enthusiasm of someone who's given up on GPS. Captain Morehouse knows this ship. He had dinner with Captain Benjamin Briggs just days before both vessels left New York. They'd shared stories, complained about the price of good rope, and probably argued about whether the weather would hold. Now here's Briggs's ship, sailing herself like some maritime autopilot experiment gone wrong. The boarding party you join moves carefully across the gangplank. There's something unsettling about stepping onto a ship that should have people but doesn't. It resembles entering a home where the coffee pot remains warm, yet no one responds to your calls. The deck is wet, but not from rain, from waves that have been washing over her bow unchecked. Below deck, the mystery deepens in ways that would make Agatha Christie jealous. The cargo is mostly intact, though some barrels of alcohol have leaked, creating a smell that's part industrial accident, part questionable cocktail party. Personal belongings are scattered, but not ransacked. It's as if everyone simply decided to step out for a moment and forgot to come back. The captain's cabin tells a particularly odd story. Charts are rolled neatly. The logbook sits open to an entry from November 25th, 10 days ago, recording their position near Santa Maria Island. The captain's wife's sewing kit is open, needle still threaded, as if she'd paused mid-stitch to answer a door that never opened. There's a half-finished letter on the desk, the ink not even fully dry, stopping mid-sentence like a conversation interrupted by something urgent. But here's where it gets genuinely strange. There's no sign of struggle, no evidence of piracy, and no indication of panic. The ship's papers are missing, which is odd because pirates typically care more about cargo than paperwork. The single lifeboat is gone, but the davits that held it show signs of hasty but deliberate lowering, not desperate cutting. You find yourself standing in the galley, looking at a pot of porridge that's gone cold and moldy. Someone had been cooking breakfast. Someone had been planning to eat it. Someone had been living their perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when something happened that made them leave everything behind. Let's discuss the folks who should have been aboard, because understanding who disappeared makes the mystery feel less like a ghost story and more like a very strange human drama. Captain Benjamin Briggs wasn't some mysterious figure. He was a seasoned mariner from a family of seafaring people, the kind of man who probably knew more knots than your average Boy Scout leader and could predict weather by sniffing the air. Briggs had brought his wife Sarah and their 2-year-old daughter Sophia on this voyage. This wasn't unusual for merchant captains of the era. Ships were often floating family homes, especially on longer journeys. Sarah was an experienced sailor's wife who could probably splice rope better than most landlubbers and certainly knew her way around a ship's galley. Little Sophia, according to letters Sarah had written to relatives, was just beginning to walk and had apparently developed a toddler's fascination with trying to eat everything she found on deck. The crew was small but competent, 7 men who'd signed on for what should have been a routine voyage to Genoa. First mate Albert Richardson was German-born but had been sailing American ships for years. The cook, Edward Head, was apparently notorious for his creative interpretations of salt pork recipes, though whether his fame was in a good way or bad way depends on which maritime memoir you believe. The curious thing about this particular group is how ordinary they were. No mysterious passengers with shady pasts, no crew members fleeing from the law, and no cargo that might attract pirates or government agents. Just a family and some working sailors transporting industrial alcohol from New York to Italy, the 1872 equivalent of hauling cleaning supplies across the country. But as you explore their abandoned quarters, you start to notice the small details that make them human. Sarah's dress is laid out neatly on the bed, as if she planned to wear it the next day. There's a child's toy tucked under a blanket in the corner, a small wooden horse with wheels, the kind any father might whittle during evening watches. In the crew's quarters, you find letters from home, some in German, others in broken English, all expressing the universal homesickness of people far from familiar places. The ship's manifest tells you they'd loaded 1,701 barrels of denatured alcohol in New York. This wasn't drinking alcohol, it was industrial stuff, poisonous if consumed, used for manufacturing, the kind of cargo that was valuable but not particularly exciting to anyone except accountants and factory owners. Hardly the sort of thing that inspires dramatic mutinies or attracts colourful pirates. What strikes you most is how the personal items are arranged. If there had been panic, you'd expect chaos. If there had been pirates, you'd expect theft. Instead, everything suggests people who left with intention, but also with haste. Sarah's jewelry is still in its box, but her coat is missing from its hook. The ship's chronometer is gone, essential for navigation, but other valuable instruments remain. Standing in the captain's quarters, you can almost imagine the conversation that might have preceded their departure. Perhaps Briggs noticed something troubling about the cargo. The fumes could be dangerous on a wooden ship. Perhaps he noticed an approaching storm that concerned him. Perhaps little Sophia had come down with something and needed immediate attention that couldn't wait for port. The last entry in the ship's log, written in Briggs's careful handwriting, simply notes their position and the weather conditions. Nothing dramatic, nothing urgent. These are merely the routine observations of a professional mariner performing his duties. It's the maritime equivalent of someone's last text message being about grocery lists, perfectly mundane until you realize it's the last thing they ever wrote. You find yourself wondering about their last meal together, their last normal moment before whatever happened. Did little Sophia play with her wooden horse that morning? Did Sarah finish mending whatever she'd been sewing? Did Captain Briggs look at his charts and feel confident about the day ahead? Now comes the fun part. The part where everyone becomes a detective and the theories multiply like rabbits in a particularly fertile meadow. Over the years, people have proposed explanations for the Mary Celeste's empty state that range from plausible to wonderfully ridiculous, and honestly, some of the ridiculous ones are more entertaining than most television shows. Let's start with the piracy theory, because it's the most obvious and also the most problematic. Pirates in 1872 were generally practical business people. They wanted cargo, money, and anything else they could sell quickly. They weren't particularly interested in kidnapping entire families and crews for no apparent reason, especially when said families included a 2-year-old who would presumably require constant attention and contribute nothing to piratical enterprises. Furthermore, the Mary Celeste's cargo was still largely intact, which suggests either the world's most polite pirates or perhaps no pirates at all. The mutiny theory has similar problems. Typically, mistreatment, underpayment, or truly awful conditions lead to mutinies among crews. Captain Briggs, by all accounts, was a decent employer who paid fair wages and didn't run his ship like a floating prison. His crew had signed on willingly and had no particular reason to revolt. Even if they had mutinied, what would they do with the captain's wife and toddler? It's not like mutineers typically find themselves equipped with a good childcare plan. Then there's the alcohol fume theory, which actually has some merit. The cargo hold contained 9 barrels that had leaked, creating potentially explosive fumes in an enclosed space. Imagine the smell of nail polish remover mixed with the exhaust from a paint factory, all concentrated in a wooden box floating on the ocean. If Captain Briggs had suspected the danger of explosion or fire, he might have ordered everyone into the lifeboat as a temporary measure, planning to return once the danger passed. This theory has the advantage of explaining the orderly departure as panic, just prudent seamanship. The lifeboat might have been intended to stay nearby while the ship aired out. Unfortunately, if a storm came up or the tow line broke, the lifeboat could have been separated from the ship, leaving the Mary Celeste to sail on alone while its passengers and crew faced the Atlantic in a boat designed for emergencies, not extended voyaging. Weather could have played a role too. Sudden, violent storms are known to appear without much warning in the area where the Mary Celeste was located. Perhaps Briggs saw something approaching that made him decide to abandon ship temporarily, only to have the weather separate them permanently from their vessel. It's the maritime equivalent of stepping out of your car to check the engine and having the car somehow drive away without you. Some theories venture into more exotic territory. Sudden tidal waves can be triggered by underwater earthquakes. Giant squids could launch dramatic attacks, potentially leaving behind signs of tentacle-induced chaos. Encounters with other vessels, which somehow manage to whisk away the entire population without disturbing the cargo or leaving witnesses, have also been reported. The truly creative theories involve everything from time warps to alien abduction to spontaneous dimensional shifts. While these make for excellent late-night conversation starters, they have the disadvantage of being completely unprovable and requiring the laws of physics to take an extended coffee break. Theories are annoying because they explain some parts of the mystery but not others. The alcohol fume theory explains the orderly departure but not why the ship continued sailing in a straight line. The weather theory explains the separation but not the missing ship's papers. The piracy theory explains the missing people but not the intact cargo. Standing on the empty deck, you realize that the Mary Celeste's greatest mystery might not be what happened, but why it happened so completely. Whatever occurred, it convinced 10 people, including a cautious sea captain and a mother with a small child, to leave a perfectly seaworthy vessel for the uncertain safety of a small lifeboat. That's not a decision anyone makes lightly. Walking through the Mary Celeste now, you become something of a forensic detective, reading the story the ship tells through 1,000 small details. Ships, like houses, hold on to the echoes of the people who live in them, and this one is practically chattering with evidence if you know how to listen. The galley holds particularly intriguing clues. The stove is cold, but there are dishes that suggest breakfast was interrupted rather than never started. A coffee pot sits on the stove with ground still in it, the kind of detail that makes you picture someone getting up early, going through their morning routine, perhaps humming while they worked. A loaf of bread, now stale, is cut as though someone intended to prepare toast or sandwiches for the day ahead. In the crew's quarters, hammocks hang empty, but show the impressions of recent use. People scatter personal items as they would if they were living normally, not as if they were packing to leave permanently. A pipe lies on a small shelf, tobacco still in the bowl. Someone had been enjoying their evening smoke when something interrupted their routine. The ship's rigging tells its own story. The sails are set, but incorrectly, not in a way that would make the ship unmanageable, but in a way that suggests someone who knew what they were doing had adjusted them quickly, perhaps to make the ship stable while unmanned. It's the nautical equivalent of putting on your hazard lights before pulling over, a sign that whatever happened was planned, at least briefly. Below deck, the cargo area reveals the most intriguing evidence. 9 barrels of alcohol have leaked, their contents evaporating and creating a concentration of fumes that would make anyone nervous. The overwhelming smell resembled a paint store during a chemical spill. Any experienced captain would recognize the leak as a serious fire hazard, especially with the ship's lanterns and cooking fires. But here's what's particularly intriguing. The cargo hatches are open. In normal circumstances, you'd keep these closed to prevent water from getting in during storms. The fact that they're open suggests someone deliberately opened them, probably to ventilate the dangerous fumes. It's evidence of logical thinking under pressure, not panic. The captain's cabin provides the most personal insights. Charts are spread on the table, showing their planned route to Genoa. Navigational instruments are mostly in place, except for the chronometer, the ship's most essential tool for determining longitude. Its absence suggests whoever left took the one thing they'd absolutely need for navigation in a small boat. Sarah Briggs's belongings paint a picture of a woman who'd settled in for a long voyage but left suddenly. Her sewing basket sits open, thread still wound around her finger as if she'd looked up from her work and never looked back down. A letter to her mother-in-law lies half-finished on the small desk, stopping mid-sentence. The baby is well and growing more adventurous each day. Yesterday, she nearly... And that's where it ends. The pen lies beside the paper, ink dried on its tip. It's one of those details that makes the hair on your arm stand up, because it's so perfectly ordinary, right up until it becomes extraordinary. Little Sophia's presence is everywhere. A wooden cup rests on the floor of the main cabin. Toys are tucked into corners where little Sophia might have left them during play. A small blanket draped over the edge of a chair, as if someone had covered her for a nap and she kicked it off in her sleep. The ship's wheel is lashed in position, another sign of deliberate action rather than panic. Someone took the time to secure the helm before leaving, ensuring the ship would sail relatively straight rather than turning in circles. It's the kind of precaution you take when you're planning to come back. Perhaps most telling of all is that it's not disturbed. Valuables remain in place. The ship's modest supply of money is untouched. Personal items of obvious sentimental value, letters, photographs, small mementos, remain where their owners left them. The event wasn't a robbery, and it wasn't a hurried flight from danger. Standing in the main cabin as afternoon light streams through the portholes, you can almost feel the moment when normal life stopped. Someone was reading. The book lies open, pages slightly ruffled by the constant sea breeze coming through the cabin door. Someone was planning dinner. Vegetables sit in a basket, some beginning to wrinkle but still fresh enough to suggest recent purchase. Back in Gibraltar, where the Mary Celeste has been towed for investigation, you find yourself in the middle of what can only be described as Victorian-era bureaucratic chaos mixed with genuine maritime mystery. The British authorities, who have jurisdiction over the case, approach it with the kind of methodical thoroughness that made the Empire run on time, but also occasionally missed the forest for the trees. Vice Admiralty Court Proctor Frederick Solly Flood takes charge of the investigation with the enthusiasm of someone who's been waiting his entire career for a genuinely intriguing case. Unfortunately, his enthusiasm is matched only by his suspicion that something sinister has occurred, which leads him to seek evidence of foul play in every water stain and piece of frayed rope. The first theory Flood pursues involves the crew of the Dei Gratia, the ship that found the Mary Celeste. His reasoning follows a certain Victorian logic. If you discover something suspicious, start by suspecting the people who found it. It's the maritime equivalent of assuming the person who reports a crime must be involved in it somehow. Captain Morehouse and his crew find themselves under intense scrutiny. Had they somehow arranged to meet the Mary Celeste at sea? Had they murdered its passengers and crew for the salvage money? The fact that Morehouse and Captain Briggs were acquaintances becomes, in Flood's mind, evidence of conspiracy rather than coincidence. The problem with this theory becomes apparent quickly. The salvage award for the Mary Celeste, while not insignificant, amounts to about 1/6 of the ship's value, hardly enough to justify multiple murders and an elaborate cover-up. Furthermore, the crew of the Dei Gratia would have had to be remarkably stupid criminals, since they voluntarily brought the suspicious vessel to port and submitted to investigation, rather than, say, sinking it quietly in the middle of the Atlantic. As the investigation continues, you watch expert after specialist examine the ship. Maritime surveyors crawl through every inch of the hull, seeking evidence of damage that might explain the abandonment. The experts determine that the ship is seaworthy, although it has clearly been sailing unmanned for some time. The rigging shows that wear is consistent with wind and weather, not sabotage. Dr. Patron, the island's physician, examines what appears to be blood on a sword found in the captain's cabin. This discovery sends Flood into paroxysms of excitement. Finally, evidence of violence. Unfortunately, further analysis suggests the stains are more likely rust mixed with some other substance, possibly fruit juice. The bloodstained sword becomes merely a rusty blade, and Dr. Patron's reputation for dramatic conclusions becomes a running joke among the other investigators. The cargo inspection reveals the leaked barrels and residual fumes, lending credence to the theory that alcohol vapors might have prompted the evacuation. Several investigators comment on the strong smell and the potential fire hazard it would represent to people living with open flames and oil lamps. One surveyor notes that similar cargo had caused fires on other vessels, making evacuation a reasonable precaution for any experienced captain. What emerges from weeks of testimony and investigation is a picture of the Mary Celeste as a perfectly ordinary merchant vessel that encountered some kind of situation requiring immediate but temporary evacuation. The evidence suggests careful preparation for departure, not panic or violence. The missing lifeboat, the opened cargo hatches for ventilation, the secured wheel, and the taken chronometer all point to intelligent decision-making under pressure. Flood, however, remains convinced that dark deeds have been done. His final report, while officially inconclusive, drips with suspicion about everyone involved. He seems particularly frustrated that no one has confessed to anything dramatic and that the evidence stubbornly refuses to support any of the more exciting theories about piracy, mutiny, or mass murder. The crew of the Dei Gratia finally receives their salvage award, though it's reduced from their original claim. They're clearly relieved to be done with the entire affair and to have their integrity intact, if slightly battered by weeks of suspicion and interrogation. As you read through the official reports, what strikes you most is how the investigation's focus on finding someone to blame obscured the more intriguing question of what actually happened. The bureaucratic need for criminal responsibility overshadowed the maritime mystery, turning what might have been a fascinating study in emergency seamanship into a frustrating search for villains who probably never existed. Standing on the dock in Gibraltar, watching the Mary Celeste rock gently in the harbour, you realize that sometimes the most interesting mysteries are the ones that resist easy answers. The Mary Celeste story didn't end with the Gibraltar investigation. If anything, that's where her second life as a legend really began. Like a celebrity who becomes more famous for being famous than for any particular talent, the ship found herself transformed from a working merchant vessel into maritime mythology. After the investigation, the ship was sold at auction and returned to service under new ownership. You might think this would be the end of her story, but ships that become famous for mysterious reasons tend to attract a particular kind of attention. Her new owners probably thought they were getting a bargain, a perfectly good brigantine with an interesting history. What they got instead was a vessel that seemed to carry her mystery like a persistent odor that wouldn't air out. Over the next 13 years, the Mary Celeste changed hands 17 times. This is roughly equivalent to a house being sold every 9 months, which suggests either terrible luck or a terrible reputation. Ships, like houses, can develop reputations that follow them from owner to owner, and the Mary Celeste's reputation was becoming distinctly problematic. Her various captains reported difficulties finding crews willing to sail on her. Sailors, who are professionally superstitious as a matter of survival, began to regard her as unlucky. Stories grew in the telling. What began as a mystery about missing people became tales of ghostly apparitions, mysterious voices in the rigging, and equipment that malfunctioned in inexplicable ways. The ship's final voyage came in 1885, when she was deliberately wrecked on a reef near Haiti in what appears to have been an insurance fraud attempt. Her last owner, G.C. Parker, had loaded her with worthless cargo but insured it for far more than its value. The plan was simple. Wreck Parker planned to sell the ship, claim the insurance, and profit from what had become an increasingly unprofitable vessel. Unfortunately for Parker, the insurance investigators were more competent than the Gibraltar officials had been. They quickly discovered the fraudulent cargo and Parker's scheme. He was prosecuted, though the case fell apart due to insufficient evidence. Apparently, proving insurance fraud was as tricky in the 1880s as it is today. The Mary Celeste's physical end on that Haitian reef was anticlimactic for a ship that had become synonymous with maritime mystery. She didn't disappear dramatically in the fog or sail off into the sunset. She simply ran aground in shallow water and broke apart in the waves, her timbers scattered by storms and salvaged by locals for more practical purposes. But her story was just beginning its strangest chapter. Writers discovered the Mary Celeste and found in her mystery the perfect foundation for fiction. Arthur Conan Doyle, before he became famous for Sherlock Holmes, wrote a short story called J. Habakkuk Jeffson's Statement that took the basic facts of the Mary Celeste and embellished them with murders, racial conspiracy, and dramatic confrontations. Doyle's story was so compelling that many people began to confuse his fiction with the actual facts. Details from his imagination, like the breakfast still warm on the table or the ship's cat found alive and well, became part of the true story in popular retellings. It's a perfect example of how a positive story can become more powerful than mere facts. Hollywood eventually discovered the Mary Celeste, producing films that bore increasingly little resemblance to the historical mystery. In movie versions, the ship became haunted, cursed, or the scene of elaborate supernatural conspiracies. Each retelling added new dramatic elements while stripping away the subtle human mystery that made the original story so compelling. Standing on a modern dock, watching contemporary ships come and go, you realize that the Mary Celeste's greatest mystery isn't what happened to her passengers and crew. It's how a straightforward maritime incident became one of history's most enduring legends. The ship herself may be gone, scattered as driftwood on a Caribbean beach, but her story continues to sail on, picking up new passengers and new theories with every telling. As you stand here, having followed the Mary Celeste's transformation from a working ship to an eternal mystery, you are likely wondering what truly happened on that November morning in 1872. Like many intriguing questions in life, this one lacks a tidy, conclusive answer. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that Captain Briggs faced some kind of emergency that convinced him to evacuate his ship temporarily. The evidence strongly suggests this wasn't a panicked flight. It was a calculated decision made by an experienced seaman who he believed he was taking a reasonable precaution. The open cargo hatches, the missing chronometer, and the orderly departure all point to someone who expected to return. The alcohol fume theory remains the most plausible explanation. Those 9 leaked barrels created a genuinely dangerous situation in the wooden confines of a 19th century ship. Experts in modern maritime studies generally concur that Briggs had the right to evacuate until the fumes dissipated. Perhaps the tragedy lay in the fact that he never had the opportunity to return. Perhaps a sudden squall separated the lifeboat from the ship. Perhaps the tow line broke in rough seas. Perhaps Briggs miscalculated the weather or the distance to land. Small boats in the Atlantic face enormous challenges, and the margin for error is slim. What seemed like a temporary precaution might have become a fatal miscalculation through no fault of anyone involved. Alternatively, the explanation could be something we have not yet considered. Maritime history is full of incidents where ships were abandoned for reasons that seemed perfectly logical at the time, but appear mysterious to later investigators. The ocean is a vast, unpredictable environment where the difference between routine and disaster can be measured in minutes. What makes the Mary Celeste story so enduringly fascinating isn't just the mystery itself, but what it reveals about our need to discover explanations for things that resist explanation. We've turned a probable emergency evacuation into a supernatural legend because the alternative, accepting that sometimes undesirable things happen to good people for mundane reasons, is somehow less satisfying than imagining elaborate conspiracies or paranormal interventions. The real people involved, Benjamin Briggs, Sarah, little Sophia, and the 7 crew members, have been overshadowed by their own mystery. Instead of being individuals who lived, worked, worried about their families, and faced a crisis that demanded immediate action, they have transformed into characters in a story. In our fascination with what happened to them, we sometimes forget that they were people much like ourselves, making the best decisions they could with the information they had. Perhaps that's the Mary Celeste's final lesson, that life rarely provides the clear-cut answers we crave, and that mystery isn't always sinister. Sometimes ships are abandoned for beneficial reasons that lead to tragic consequences. Sometimes people make reasonable decisions that have unreasonable outcomes. Occasionally, the most extraordinary mysteries have the most ordinary explanations. As you settle back into your comfortable spot, maybe finishing that cup of tea that's been growing cold while we wandered through this maritime puzzle, consider that the Mary Celeste's greatest gift might not be her mystery, but her reminder that the world is full of stories we'll never completely understand, and perhaps that's acceptable. Perhaps some questions are more valuable than their answers, and some mysteries are worth preserving, not because they're supernatural, but because they're beautifully, frustratingly human. The Mary Celeste sails on in our imagination, her sails set for destinations we'll never know, carrying passengers we'll never meet again, bound for ports that exist only in the space between what we know and what we wonder. And sometimes, just before you fall asleep, you might find yourself wondering what little Sophia would have grown up to become, and whether Captain Briggs ever regretted that final decision to lower the lifeboat on what seemed like just another ordinary day at sea. In the summer of 1917, Catherine Wiley stepped through the factory doors of the United States Radium Corporation in Orange, New Jersey, clutching her employment letter with trembling fingers. At 19, she had never imagined that her penmanship skills would land her such a coveted position. The war effort demanded precision workers, and dial painting paid better than most jobs for young women. The factory floor buzzed with activity. Rows of women sat hunched over workbenches, their faces illuminated by the ethereal green glow emanating from small glass vials. Catherine had never seen anything quite so beautiful. The radium paint seemed to capture moonlight itself, holding it prisoner in each tiny brushstroke applied to watch faces destined for soldiers overseas. Mrs. Margaret Carlo, the floor supervisor, appeared beside Catherine's shoulder. Her breath carried the metallic scent that Catherine would later recognize as radium's signature calling card. "Welcome to the most important work a young lady can do for her country," Mrs. Carlo announced, gesturing toward an empty station. "Each timepiece you paint might save a soldier's life in the trenches. They need to read their watches in complete darkness." The instructions seemed simple enough. Dip the camel hairbrush in radium paint, point the tip between your lips to achieve the finest possible line, then carefully trace the numerals on each watch dial. The technique, known as lip pointing, had been perfected by experienced workers who could complete a watch face in mere minutes. Catherine watched Grace Fryer, a seasoned dial painter, demonstrate the method with practiced ease. "The taste takes some getting used to," Grace admitted, wiping her lips with the back of her hand. A faint luminescent residue remained on her skin, but you'll hardly notice it after a few days. Some of the girls even say it's rather pleasant, slightly sweet with a mineral finish. Catherine's first attempt proved clumsy. The brush felt unwieldy between her lips, and the paint seemed to resist her guidance. Mrs. Carlo observed patiently before offering encouragement. "Don't worry, dear. Yesterday's new girl is already painting 12 watches an hour. The company pays 5 cents per completed dial, so your earnings depend entirely on your speed and accuracy." The mathematics appealed to Catherine's practical nature. If she could match the productivity of experienced workers, she might earn more in a week than her father made in a month at the textile mill. The war had created unprecedented opportunities for women willing to master specialized skills. As the afternoon progressed, Catherine found her rhythm. The radium paint began to feel familiar on her tongue, and her brushstrokes grew more confident. Around her, conversations flowed freely among the workers. They discussed everything from the latest motion pictures to their brothers and sweethearts fighting in France. "Have you noticed how our clothes glow after work?" asked Molly Maggia, a petite brunette who had been with the company for nearly 2 years. She held up her apron, which indeed seemed to emit a faint luminescence in the factory's shadowed corners. "Sometimes I can read by my own light when I get home. My little sister thinks I'm magical." The women laughed at this revelation, comparing their glowing fingernails and hair. Some had begun wearing their best dresses to work, delighting in how the radium dust transformed ordinary fabric into something otherworldly. They called themselves the Ghost Girls and took pride in their unique appearance. Catherine soon discovered that the luminous effects extended beyond mere clothing. Her teeth had acquired a subtle gleam that made her smile particularly striking in dim light. Her mother initially expressed concern, but Catherine assured her that the company's medical examinations had found all the workers in perfect health. Dr. Cecil Drinker, who occasionally visited the factory to observe operations, had even complimented the women on their robust appearance. He mentioned that radium was being used in various health tonics and cosmetics, suggesting that their daily exposure might actually provide beneficial effects. Several society women in New York had begun paying substantial sums for radium treatments at exclusive spas. The work environment fostered a sense of camaraderie that Catherine had never experienced. The women shared lunches, celebrated birthdays, and discussed their dreams for the future. Many hoped to save enough money to attend secretarial school or help their families purchase homes. The war had created a temporary window of economic opportunity that none wanted to waste. As autumn approached, Catherine had mastered the lip-pointing technique and consistently painted 20 watches per hour. Her weekly earnings exceeded those of most men in her neighborhood, and she took pride in contributing significantly to her family's income. The mysterious green glow had become as familiar as daylight, and she couldn't imagine working anywhere else. Yet subtle changes had begun to manifest among some of the longer-term employees. Grace Fryer occasionally complained of jaw pain, and Molly Maggia had developed an unusual fatigue that seemed unrelated to the demanding work schedule. Catherine noticed these developments, but attributed them to the natural stresses of wartime employment. The radium paint continued to fascinate her. Each brushstroke seemed to capture starlight, and she marveled at the scientific breakthrough that made such illumination possible. Marie Curie's discovery had revolutionized industry and medicine, and Catherine felt honored to participate in its practical application. By the spring of 1918, the United States Radium Corporation had expanded its operations considerably. The factory now employed over 200 women, working in shifts around the clock to meet military contracts. Catherine Wiley had become one of the most productive dial painters, earning recognition from management and the respect of her colleagues. However, disturbing patterns had begun to emerge among the workforce. Molly Maggia, once the most vivacious worker on the floor, had developed a persistent cough that echoed through the factory halls. Her complexion, previously radiant with health, had taken on a greyish pallor that concerned her fellow workers. "It's just the spring weather," Molly insisted when Catherine expressed worry. "My mother always said the changing seasons affect some people more than others." Yet her voice had grown hoarse, and she frequently paused during conversations to catch her breath. Grace Fryer had also begun experiencing unusual symptoms. Her jaw ached constantly, particularly when she awakened in the morning. The company nurse, Miss Davies, suggested that Grace might be grinding her teeth due to the concentration required for detailed work. She recommended a nightly mouth guard and advised Grace to chew gum during her breaks to exercise the jaw muscles. Catherine found herself studying her colleagues more carefully. She noticed that several women who had worked at the factory for over 18 months displayed similar characteristics. Their energy levels had declined noticeably, and they seemed to tire more easily during the demanding workdays. Some complained of mysterious bone pain that seemed to migrate throughout their bodies. The company's response to these health concerns remained consistently reassuring. Dr. Stanford, the industrial physician who conducted monthly examinations, emphasized that radium was being prescribed by leading medical professionals for various ailments. He cited recent articles in medical journals that praised radium's therapeutic properties for treating arthritis, tuberculosis, and other conditions. "You ladies are receiving the equivalent of expensive medical treatments simply by performing your patriotic duties," Dr. Stanford explained during one of his visits. "Some wealthy patients pay hundreds of dollars for radium therapy that you receive naturally through your work environment." Catherine wanted to believe these explanations, but her observational skills had sharpened during her months at the factory. She began keeping private notes about the changes she witnessed among her colleagues. The documentation started innocently enough, merely recording who seemed tired or complained of specific symptoms. The most troubling development involved Molly Maggia's teeth. What had begun as minor jaw discomfort had progressed to serious dental problems. 2 of her molars had become loose, and her dentist expressed bewilderment about the condition. He had never encountered a tooth deterioration of such severity in such a young, otherwise healthy patient. Molly tried to maintain her characteristic optimism, but the pain had begun affecting her work performance. She could no longer point her brush between her lips without experiencing sharp discomfort. Mrs. Carla reluctantly assigned her to mixing paint, a position that paid less but required minimal lip contact with the brush. Catherine also noticed changes in her body, though she initially dismissed them as insignificant. Her fingernails had become brittle, breaking easily despite her careful attention to hand care. More concerning was a persistent metallic taste that had developed over the past month. Even her favorite foods seemed to carry an underlying mineral flavor. The social dynamics among the workers had begun to shift as well. Those experiencing health problems formed informal support groups, sharing remedies and comparing symptoms. Newer employees, such as Catherine, struggled to balance their loyalty to longtime colleagues with their fear of jeopardizing their own positions by acknowledging the problems. Miss Sarah Mylifer developed an unusual rash on her hands and forearms just 2 months after she started working at the factory with Catherine. The company nurse suggested she might be allergic to the soap used in the washrooms, but the condition persisted despite switching to different cleansing products. Catherine began to research radium independently, spending her evenings at the public library reading scientific journals and medical texts. The information she discovered proved contradictory. While some sources praised radium's therapeutic applications, others mentioned potential hazards associated with excessive exposure. One article particularly caught her attention. A researcher in Europe had reported cases of radium poisoning among scientists working with radioactive materials. The symptoms described in the study matched many of the problems she had observed among her colleagues: anemia, bone pain, dental deterioration, and progressive weakness. When Catherine mentioned this research to Grace Fryer, her friend's reaction surprised her. Grace admitted that she had also been conducting private investigations into radium's effects. Together, they began to document their observations more systematically, creating a detailed record of health changes among the factory workers. Their informal study revealed disturbing patterns. Women who had worked at the factory longest showed the most severe symptoms. Those who painted the most watches per day, requiring frequent lip pointing, seemed particularly affected. The correlation between exposure duration and health problems appeared undeniable. Catherine faced a troubling dilemma. She needed her job to support her family, and the work had provided financial security beyond her previous dreams. Yet the evidence suggested that continued exposure to radium might be harming her health and that of her colleagues. The company's medical authorities continued to insist that radium posed no dangers, but their reassurances rang increasingly hollow. The mystery deepened when Catherine learned that several former employees had left the factory due to illness. When she attempted to contact these women, she discovered that some had died from conditions that their doctors could not adequately explain. The company had not informed current employees about these deaths, and Catherine began to suspect that management might be deliberately concealing important information. The devastating news of summer 1918 rocked the foundation of Catherine Wiley's meticulously crafted world. Molly Maggia, the spirited young woman who had welcomed Catherine to the factory floor just 1 year earlier, had died at the age of 24. The official cause of death listed syphilis, a diagnosis that outraged those who knew Molly's character and moral standards. Catherine stood in the cemetery beside Grace Fryer and a dozen other dial painters, watching as Molly's coffin was lowered into the ground. The funeral director had mentioned something peculiar to Molly's sister. The body seemed to emit a faint glow, even in death. This detail was whispered among the mourners, but never officially acknowledged. Dr. Barry, who had attended Molly during her final weeks, privately expressed doubts about the syphilis diagnosis. He confided to Molly's family that he had never encountered such extensive bone deterioration and jaw necrosis in any syphilis patient. Her jawbone had literally crumbled in his hands during examination, yet other symptoms typical of the disease were entirely absent. The factory management's response to Molly's death proved coldly bureaucratic. Mrs. Carlo announced that while the company regretted the loss, medical experts had confirmed that her illness bore no relation to her employment. Workers were reminded that radium exposure remained perfectly safe and that their medical examinations continued to show normal results. Catherine had begun to question the reliability of these medical examinations. The company physicians seemed to focus exclusively on weight measurements and general appearance while ignoring specific complaints about jaw pain, fatigue, and dental problems. Often, the company physicians dismissed workers who mentioned concerning symptoms by suggesting better nutrition or increased exercise. Grace Fryer had grown increasingly militant about the situation. She began organizing informal meetings among the workers to discuss their health concerns and share information. These gatherings took place away from the factory, usually in someone's home or at a local church social hall. Catherine initially hesitated to attend, fearing repercussions from management, but her loyalty to her colleagues eventually overcame her caution. During one such meeting, the women compiled a disturbing inventory of health problems. Edna Hussman reported that her teeth were loosening and that her jaw ached constantly. Quinta MacDonald described mysterious anemia that left her exhausted despite adequate rest and nutrition. Albina Larice had developed a limp due to unexplained hip pain that worsened each month. The pattern became undeniable when they compared notes systematically. Every woman who had worked at the factory for more than 6 months reported some combination of dental problems, bone pain, anemia, or mysterious rashes. The longest employed women displayed the most severe symptoms. The correlation between duration of employment and illness severity could not be explained as coincidence. Catherine's own health had begun to deteriorate more noticeably. Her menstrual periods had become irregular, and she experienced frequent headaches that seemed unrelated to stress or fatigue. Most disturbing was the persistent metallic taste that had intensified to the point where food had lost much of its appeal. She had lost 12 pounds over the past 3 months, despite maintaining her usual diet. The women decided to seek independent medical opinions from physicians not affiliated with the United States Radium Corporation. Dr. Theodore Blum, a dentist in Newark, agreed to examine several of the workers without charge. His findings proved alarming and would later contribute to medical literature under the term radium jaw. Dr. Blum discovered extensive bone necrosis in every patient he examined. The jaw bones showed signs of progressive deterioration that he had never encountered in his decades of practice. He documented his findings meticulously, noting that the bone damage appeared to radiate outward from the areas of greatest radium concentration. When Dr. Blum attempted to contact the company's medical staff to discuss his findings, he encountered surprising resistance. The company physicians questioned his qualifications and suggested that the patient's psychological expectations might bias his examinations. They maintained that extensive research had proven radium's safety and that isolated cases of illness could not be attributed to workplace exposure. Catherine began to research the backgrounds of the company's medical advisors. She discovered that several had financial interests in radium-related businesses and that their opinions might not be entirely objective. This revelation reinforced her increasing belief that the company was purposefully misleading the workers about the risks associated with their employment. Some workers reported pressure from company representatives to refrain from seeking outside medical attention, further complicating the situation. Supervisors suggested that discussing health problems with unauthorized physicians might be considered disloyal to the war effort. The company reminded some workers that sharing information about factory operations might violate confidentiality clauses in defense contracts. Grace Fryer had grown increasingly frustrated with the company's evasive responses to their concerns. She began contacting former employees who had left due to illness, attempting to document the full scope of the health crisis. Many of these women reported that their conditions had continued to deteriorate even after leaving the factory, suggesting that radium exposure might cause permanent damage. The mystery deepened when Catherine learned about similar problems at radium dial factories in other locations. Workers in Ottawa, Illinois, and Waterbury, Connecticut had reported health issues identical to those experienced in Orange, New Jersey. The consistency of symptoms across different facilities suggested a systemic problem rather than isolated incidents. Catherine faced an increasingly difficult choice. Her family depended on her income, and factory jobs remained scarce for young women without extensive education. Yet continuing to work at the United States Radium Corporation might be slowly killing her. The glowing paint that had once seemed so beautiful now appeared sinister, each brushstroke potentially adding to her accumulated exposure to a substance that might be destroying her body from within. The war had ended, but the battle for the truth about radium exposure was just beginning. Catherine realized that she and her colleagues might need to challenge not only their employer, but also the medical establishment and possibly the government itself to protect their health and ensure that other young women would not face similar dangers. By the autumn of 1919, Catherine Wiley had transformed from an eager young worker into an amateur detective, methodically documenting evidence of what appeared to be a systematic cover-up. The United States Radium Corporation initiated new policies that appeared to shield workers from uncovering the truth about their declining health. The company had installed new ventilation systems and required workers to use different brushes, claiming these changes would improve efficiency. However, Catherine noticed that management personnel had begun wearing protective equipment when visiting the factory floor, while workers continued their daily exposure without any protective measures. This discrepancy raised disturbing questions about what company officials actually knew about radium's dangers. Dr. Cecil Drinker returned to the factory that autumn to conduct what he described as a routine industrial hygiene study. Catherine observed his visit carefully, noting that he spent considerable time measuring air quality and collecting samples from work surfaces. His demeanor seemed more serious than during previous visits, and he asked pointed questions about worker health that suggested genuine concern rather than routine inquiry. When Dr. Drinker's report was completed several months later, the company refused to share its contents with employees. Through a contact at the local health department, Catherine learned that the study had identified significant safety hazards and recommended immediate implementation of protective measures. Yet workers received no information about these findings or the recommended changes. Grace Fryer had continued organizing meetings among affected workers, and their informal network had grown to include women from factories in other states. Through correspondence and occasional visits, they had documented identical health problems among radium dial painters throughout the country. The consistency of symptoms across different locations strengthened their conviction that radium exposure was causing their illnesses. The legal implications of their situation became clearer when Catherine contacted attorney Leonard Grossman, who specialized in workplace injury cases. Grossman's initial assessment proved sobering. He explained that proving corporate liability for occupational illness required extensive medical evidence and expert testimony that might be difficult to obtain. Companies typically argued that worker health problems resulted from pre-existing conditions or lifestyle factors unrelated to employment. Grossman also warned that the radium industry wielded considerable political influence due to its importance for national defense and medical applications. Challenging such companies would require substantial financial resources and the willingness to endure prolonged legal battles against well-funded opponents. Many attorneys would be reluctant to accept cases with uncertain outcomes against powerful corporate interests. Catherine's personal health continued to deteriorate despite her efforts to minimize exposure by avoiding the lip-pointing technique. Her anemia had worsened to the point where climbing stairs left her breathless, and her bone pain had become constant. Most troubling was the discovery of several loose teeth, a development that filled her with dread given what had happened to Molly Maggia. The company's response to worker health complaints had become increasingly defensive and legalistic. When Edna Hussman collapsed at her workstation due to severe anemia, company representatives suggested that her condition might be related to poor nutrition or personal habits rather than workplace exposure. They emphasized that medical examinations continued to show that most workers remained healthy. Catherine began to suspect that the company's medical examinations were deliberately designed to avoid detecting radium-related illness. the physicians focused on general appearance and weight while ignoring specific symptoms that workers reported. Blood tests were rarely performed, and dental examinations were not included in the standard screening protocol. Through her library research, Catherine discovered disturbing information about the radium industry's knowledge of health hazards. Scientific papers published in European journals described cases of radium poisoning among researchers and industrial workers. Some of these studies had been available for several years, suggesting that American companies might have been aware of potential dangers long before problems emerged among dial painters. The most damning evidence came from internal company documents that Catherine obtained through a sympathetic clerk in the corporate offices. These papers revealed that executives had discussed worker health problems in private correspondence while publicly maintaining that radium exposure was perfectly safe. The documents suggested a deliberate strategy to minimize legal liability by avoiding acknowledgement of workplace hazards. Catherine shared these discoveries with Grace Fryer and their growing network of affected workers. Despite the difficulties they would encounter, the evidence made them more determined to take legal action. They realized that their case might establish important precedents for workplace safety and corporate responsibility that could protect future generations of workers. The women decided to seek additional medical evidence by consulting independent specialists who had no financial ties to the radium industry. Dr. Harrison Martland, a pathologist at Newark City Hospital, agreed to examine several of the workers and conduct laboratory tests to determine whether their bodies contain elevated levels of radioactive materials. Dr. Martland's findings provided the scientific foundation they needed to challenge the company's claims. His tests revealed that the workers' bodies contained significant amounts of radium that continued to emit radiation years after their initial exposure. The radioactive material had accumulated in their bones and organs, causing ongoing cellular damage that explained their progressive health deterioration. Armed with this medical evidence, Catherine and her colleagues began preparing for what would become one of the most important workplace safety cases in American legal history. They understood that their battle would require not only legal expertise but also public support to overcome the powerful interests arrayed against them. The glowing paint that had once seemed miraculous now represented betrayal and corporate callousness. Catherine realized that her personal struggle for justice had evolved into something much larger, a fight to establish the principle that workers had the right to know about workplace hazards and to receive protection from employers who prioritize profits over human safety. The conspiracy of silence that had protected the radium industry was beginning to crack, but Catherine knew that exposing the truth would require courage, persistence, and sacrifices that would test her resolve in ways she had never imagined. Dr. Harrison Martland's laboratory at Newark City Hospital became the epicenter of groundbreaking research that would revolutionize understanding of occupational radiation exposure. Catherine Wiley found herself at the forefront of medical history as one of the first documented cases of chronic radium poisoning in industrial workers. The pathologist's investigations required Catherine and her colleagues to undergo extensive testing procedures that were both invasive and emotionally challenging. Dr. Martland collected blood samples, bone marrow specimens, and tissue biopsies to document the physiological changes caused by radium exposure. Each test revealed additional evidence of the systematic damage that radioactive materials had inflicted on their bodies. The most dramatic demonstration of their contamination occurred when Dr. Martland used a newly developed instrument called an electroscope to measure the radioactivity present in their bodies. Catherine watched in fascination and horror as the device detected significant radiation levels in her breath, saliva, and even her clothing. The measurements proved that she had become a living source of radioactive contamination. Dr. Martland documented his findings with meticulous care, recognizing that his research would face intense scrutiny from the radium industry and skeptical medical colleagues. He photographed bone deterioration, recorded blood count abnormalities, and measured radiation levels with unprecedented precision. His laboratory notes would eventually become crucial evidence in legal proceedings against the United States Radium Corporation. The pathologist's research revealed that radium behaved differently in the human body than previously understood. Rather than being quickly eliminated like most foreign substances, radioactive radium accumulated in bone tissue, where it continued to emit radiation for years. This internal contamination caused progressive damage to blood-forming organs and bone structure that explained the worker's deteriorating health. Catherine learned that her body would continue to be radioactive for the rest of her life. Dr. Martland explained that radium had a half-life of over 1,500 years, meaning that the radioactive material in her bones would remain dangerous for millennia. This revelation transformed her understanding of her situation from a temporary health crisis to a permanent condition that would affect her for decades. The scientific implications of Dr. Martland's research extended far beyond the immediate case of the dial painters. His work provided the first comprehensive documentation of chronic radiation exposure in humans, establishing principles that would later guide radiation safety regulations in nuclear industries. The tragic experience of Catherine and her colleagues contributed to knowledge that would protect future generations of workers. Dr. Martland's findings attracted attention from researchers around the world who recognized the significance of his discoveries. International medical journals began publishing his studies, and scientists from various countries requested additional information about the dial painters' cases. Catherine realized that her personal struggle had become part of a global effort to understand radiation's effects on human health. The company's response to Dr. Martland's research proved predictably hostile. Corporate attorneys attempted to discredit his methodology and question his qualifications, despite his impeccable credentials and careful documentation. They argued that his findings might be influenced by bias toward the workers or desire for publicity rather than objective scientific inquiry. Industry representatives also challenged the connection between workplace exposure and worker illness, suggesting that the health problems might result from other factors. They cited medical opinions from company-affiliated physicians who maintained that radium exposure remained safe within established limits. These conflicting expert opinions created confusion that benefited the company's legal position. Catherine began to understand the broader implications of her case for industrial medicine and worker protection. The legal system's traditional approach to occupational illness required workers to prove that their employers had been negligent or had violated established safety standards. However, radium's dangers had been largely unknown when she began working at the factory, complicating efforts to establish corporate liability. Dr. Martland's research also revealed disturbing information about the company's knowledge of radium hazards. His investigation uncovered evidence that corporate officials had been aware of potential health risks much earlier than they had publicly acknowledged. Internal documents suggested that safety precautions had been implemented for executives and laboratory personnel, while production workers continued their exposure without protection. The pathologist's work attracted support from other medical professionals who recognized the importance of his research. Dr. Alice Hamilton, a pioneer in occupational medicine, praised his scientific rigor and endorsed his conclusions about radium's dangers. Her support lent credibility to the workers' claims and helped counter industry attempts to discredit the research. Catherine found herself becoming an advocate for industrial safety reform beyond her personal legal case. She began speaking to women's organizations and labor groups about the importance of workplace health protection. Her first-hand experience with corporate deception and medical cover-ups gave her testimony emotional power that resonated with audiences concerned about worker welfare. The scientific evidence accumulated by Dr. Martland provided the foundation for broader reforms in industrial hygiene and occupational medicine. His work demonstrated the need for independent medical monitoring of workers exposed to potentially hazardous materials and established principles for evaluating long-term health effects of industrial chemicals. Catherine's transformation from naive factory worker to informed advocate reflected broader changes in American society's understanding of industrial responsibility and worker rights. Her case would contribute to legal precedents that expanded corporate liability for occupational illness and established workers' rights to information about workplace hazards. The glowing legacy of her exposure to radium had evolved from personal tragedy to scientific breakthrough that would protect countless future workers from similar dangers. Catherine began to see her suffering as meaningful if it prevented other young women from experiencing the deception and health destruction that she and her colleagues had endured.